With a debt of $38 trillion, the United States has reached the highest level of debt in its history. So what about other countries? In fact, it is not much different. In today's world, all countries are in debt. While the European Union has approximately $14 trillion and Japan has $9 trillion, is the situation any different in oil-rich Saudi Arabia or in industrial and export powerhouse countries such as Germany and China? But here is a paradox. If everyone is in debt, then who exactly is the creditor? Welcome to The Money Behind History, a place where the hidden details of money, power, and history are discussed. Here, you will discover a world where nothing is as simple as it seems. Is debt a burden that countries must pay? In fact, it is not exactly that. The modern world is built on an architecture of debt. Wars, crises, economic rises and falls are supported by a delicate skeleton of debt. If you examine the chain of creditors carefully enough, you will discover something unsettling. Everyone is in debt, but it is not entirely clear to whom. In fact, the system is in debt to itself. But just as not everyone is indebted in equal amounts, creditors are not creditors in equal amounts either. I know it sounds complicated. Today, the total debt of the world's countries exceeds $315 trillion. This amount is nearly 3 times the size of the global economy. But how is this possible? To understand how we arrived at this situation, we need to know how it all began. The first idea of national debt did not emerge on Wall Street, as you might expect, but much earlier than the modern financial system in war. As the 1700s approached, the war between England and France was rapidly draining the country's resources. The king, in dire straits, asked merchants for help. He offered an interest plan that would be paid with taxes collected from the public after the war ended. In return for this plan, the merchants agreed to help the king. This plan also formed the foundation of the Bank of England. At the time, this plan was a financial revolution. The state could spend money now that it would only have in the future. In return, the merchants received a promise from the state. This promise could be bought and sold or transferred. This was the birth of the government bond. In other words, the birth of the modern financial system. When explained this way, it sounds simpler, doesn't it? This plan was copied word for word by France. It was slightly improved by the Netherlands and fully adopted by the United States. In the past, debt was a sign of failure. Now, it became a measure of the trust that holders of power had in the state. The more a state could borrow, the more hope it promised. In the past, a state had to extract gold to become wealthy. Now, it began issuing bonds. War had created its own economy. So what happened when we moved from the 1700s to the 2000s? If I asked you what the world's dominant export is, what would you say? Yes, you guessed it right. Debt. Global borrowing increases by about $1 trillion every 100 days. As a result, every country is in debt. All banks lend money, and every citizen, through taxes, savings, and pensions, is considered both a debtor and a creditor. So how is this system controlled? Who is holding the rope? Let's start with the United States. Because U.S. debt is not only national, it is global debt. Listen carefully from here on. Approximately half, that is 50%, of the United States' $38 trillion debt is publicly held. In other words, the debt is owed not to other government institutions, but to investors. About two-thirds of these investors are American banks, pension funds, mutual funds, insurance companies, and the Federal Reserve itself. The remaining third, about $9 trillion, is held by foreign entities. The largest creditor is Japan, with approximately $1 trillion. China ranks second with around $800 billion. The list continues with the United Kingdom, Luxembourg, and Belgium. So America's debt to China equals only about 2% of its total debt. The majority of America's debt is owed to America itself. The system works as follows. The Treasury issues bonds. Banks and funds buy these bonds. The Federal Reserve often buys these bonds back, creating new dollars in the process. Americans pay taxes. These taxes fund the interest on the bonds, and that interest flows back into American retirement accounts. This is a circular mirror. The debt is real, but the creditor is mostly a reflection of the same system. And this cycle is not unique to America. Let's continue with Japan. Japan lends to the United States through Treasury bonds. The United States lends to Europe through the IMF. Europe lends to developing countries through the World Bank. Developing countries then lend back to advanced economies by parking their foreign exchange reserves in Western bonds. Once again, we are faced with a cycle. This can be thought of as a global game of hot potato. The only difference between the system and the game is that the potato is made of promises. Every country holds another country's debt instrument. Every promise is secured by another promise. It is as if every poker player at the table has borrowed chips from the player next to them. As long as no one stands up, the game continues. But there is a fourth layer that is more powerful than all the others. This layer is the markets themselves. Behind every government bond is a structure made up of a network of institutions, hedge funds, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks managing tens of trillions of dollars form this structure. These institutions are the true arbiters of credit. They decide which countries can borrow cheaply and which must pay a premium to survive. These institutions are so powerful that when they lose confidence, national currencies collapse, governments fall, and entire economies can be shattered overnight. Democracy decides who governs. Markets decide who survives. At the top of this system sits the central bank. The central bank determines the rules of the modern era. Central banks do not merely manage debt, they produce it. When the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank buys government bonds, new money is created by the central bank in return. The liability of one balance sheet becomes the asset of another. Every dollar in circulation represents a debt somewhere else. There is no such thing as debt-free money. Every coin, every banknote, every digital dollar carries a debt note behind it. For decades, this cycle has been sustained by trust. As long as investors believe that governments will pay the interest, the machine keeps turning. But what happens if this trust is shaken? We have seen this before. Let's go to Greece in 2010. At that time, the state's debt became unpayable. Bondholders panicked and trust was shaken. Yields suddenly spiked. The European Central Bank and the IMF intervened. However, their rescue manifested as austerity policies. The result of the solution led to other problems: tax increases, spending cuts, and mass unemployment. In other words, the Greek people were told, make sacrifices to survive. The burden of the debt was spread onto the public. What about Argentina? In Argentina, which has been in economic crisis for years, repeated defaults turned debt into a national curse. In Sri Lanka, the government became unable to find foreign currency to pay its debts. This resulted in fuel shortages and political collapse. When the system collapses, trust is shaken. Panicked creditors suddenly become visible. These creditors are the IMF, credit rating agencies, and anonymous bondholders who hold entire nations by the throat. Even if the system collapses, this logic always restarts in the same way. Old debts are restructured, new loans replace old ones, the system resets and takes on a new name on the same balance sheet. Because in the 21st century, debt is not designed to be repaid, but to be transferred. Today, governments do not plan to pay off their debts. The goal is simply for the system to function and for the cycle not to break. When you or I take out a loan, we are expected to repay the principal. But governments operate differently. They treat debt like a continuously renewed subscription. They issue new bonds to pay off old ones. Economists call this refinancing. The real product here is interest. It is like rent paid for continuity. The global economy is now dependent on this rent. Today, the United States does not plan to pay off its $38 trillion debt and likely never will. Japan has been rolling over its debt for decades. Its debt now exceeds 250% of its GDP. And despite this, government bond yields remain near zero. Interestingly, investors are not waiting for repayment either. They are waiting for the deal to reset. Why? Because for them, government debt is the safest collateral in existence. A U.S. Treasury bond is not seen as a liability, but as an asset. Pension funds hold it. Banks use it as collateral. Central banks accept it as money. Ultimately, a U.S. Treasury bond is the concrete proof that a promise has been turned into value. The system is based on governments never paying off their debts. As long as debts are not paid, the system continues to function. Because if debts were paid, the world would lose its most reliable financial instrument. Let's imagine the opposite. What if Washington somehow decided to pay off all its debt? In that case, banks and funds all over the world would suddenly lose their most stable assets. The dollar supply would visibly shrink, triggering deflation and collapse. Paying off the debt would destroy the very thing that makes the economy function. That is why governments do the opposite. They issue more debt. They simply do it in a controlled manner and at a certain pace. Debt is like a heart for capitalism itself, a heart beating in every pension, every mortgage, and every market on earth. That is why, when politicians talk about balancing the budget or paying off national debts, remember that this is an illusion. The goal is not to eliminate debt. The goal is for you to believe that it is sustainable and payable. Because the system must appear attractive enough for you to keep believing in it. Because once trust is lost, numbers no longer matter. When trust collapses, interest rates spike, and an economy built entirely on promises comes to a halt. This is the real secret of debt. The plan is not to repay it, but to make you believe it will be repaid. As long as this trust holds, the numbers can stretch indefinitely, but trust is not distributed equally. When we say we owe the debt to ourselves, this is not entirely true. Interest payments are not shared equally across society. They flow upward from taxpayers and workers to the institutions and investors who hold the debt. So debt is not only a transfer between countries, it is also a transfer between classes. That is why global inequality and global debt are connected. They rise together. The system rewards those who hold the debt and punishes those who pay it. I know it sounds ruthless, but this is the reality. If we consider the debt system as an engine, creditors and debtors are the two main parts working against each other. The fuel of the engine is trust. The real problem emerges when trust, the fuel of the engine, runs out. Problems begin when new borrowing can no longer keep pace with the promises made before. That is when the question, who is the creditor, arises. The modern financial system has turned debt itself into money. Governments turned debt into value by issuing it. Banks multiplied this value and sold it to investors. Citizens who borrowed from investors became dependent on the system. Debt once meant bondage. Today, it means the key to a balanced financial system. But if that balance breaks even once, if trust is broken even once, the illusion ends, and we remember what debt really is. If this story gave you a new perspective, please like the video and subscribe. On this channel, I will tell you the story behind the money.